Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I'd like to share with you a project I recently finished. So this is the Scout Trooper Blaster. This was originally seen in Return of the Jedi, but more recently in The Mandalorian. I'll have additional build details in my RPF link that I'll include below in the description, as well as details around where I got this kit from, which is Polymer Armory. So I did some research, not too much, but I wanted a fairly accurate version of this particular blaster. So Polymer Armory came highly recommended. They do have a website, but I found it was easier to reach them through their Facebook page. But overall, this started off as a very good cast of the blaster. There was very little cleanup required. It was primarily the seam lines around the midline of the blaster, and then really filling in some of the drain holes that was used. So most of it was down here, the drain holes. There's a few in there as well as down here. So, but it was a super nice clean cast. Does require a little bit of cleanup work, but that was expected. So that in itself made this project very easy and enjoyable, let's say. So from a filling process, I started with this Vallejo plastic putty. This was pretty convenient because of the tip here to fill all of the drain holes. But then when I moved to the seam lines, ended up using Tamiya putty. I found this to be much easier to work with and to fill the seams, and I was able to manipulate it much easier with this. Just make sure you're in a well ventilated space, because this does give off some pretty noxious fumes, so just be aware of that. So basically the process was, once I filled everything, sanded it down, and I actually ended up using a nail file. So it has a coarse side and a fine side, but this I found very convenient because you can see here I cut this here, but you can cut this into a shape that will fit into all of the various grooves, so you have pretty good control over that. I was also able to use this for the weathering, which I'll get to later on. So, but once the blaster and all the pieces were prepped, I basically went through, I primed everything with Krylon gray primer, and then went back, sanded it down, filled in some spots, kind of repeated it, I think one additional time, and then everything was ready to go for painting. There's two metal pieces really here. One is the trigger guard here, and then the scope ring. They also provide you a resin scope ring, but I decided to go with the metal for the final build. But for that, I used some Rust-Oleum self-etching primer for those pieces, and then that was really the prep that I needed for that. From a painting standpoint, I used Krylon satin spray paint. That went on pretty nicely here, and then I dusted it with some Krylon flat afterwards, just to reduce some of the sheen. So I kind of liked a less glossier look. So even though I think semi-gloss could be used, to me that felt a little bit too bright for me. So at the end of that, I moved on to the weathering part, which for the most part it's typically the more enjoyable aspect of building props, because it makes it look a little bit more real world. And for at least this particular blaster, there's not a whole lot of weathering that is needed, but I started off with some quadruple zero steel wool to knock back the sheen, and then also to break it up so that it doesn't look so uniform. And then I also used the steel wool to focus on some of the high wear areas. So the way that this blaster is used, it's holstered on the right calf of the Scout Trooper, so it'll holster like this. And so that's where you see most of the damage or wear is on the left side of the blaster. And then I focused on the higher wear areas, so around the grip area here, right around this area, maybe you can see. And so I replicated as much as I could some of the damage that you see from the reference photos, but following that, really was just looking to see where some of the wear would occur. So you can see some of it there around the edges here, in particular this area. So then after I've finished on the initial kind of high wear areas, I moved on to the more specific damage and weathering sections. So this is one of those characteristic areas here. You'll see some of the leading edges on the left hand side. You can see some of the scuffing here. So just kind of go through and you try to create some damage that looks or is consistent with real world. You don't want to overdo it, but you want it just enough so you can see some of the damage there. And again, I use the same nail file for that, and so you have pretty good control over it to wear through the black paint, but not so much that you're going down to the cast itself. But yeah, and then again, just to kind of focus on where some of the natural wear may look. But the nice thing about this particular blaster is that the weathering isn't so significant, and there's other scenes where it shows a pretty clean blaster, and then other scenes where you can see some of the wear. So I think this was fairly straightforward. So one change or modification I did do was the leading edge here of the trigger guard. I beveled that to give that diagonal shape a little better match to what you see in the reference photos. But other than that, this was a fantastic kit, very easy to work with, and that was really what made this project pretty darn easy and enjoyable. So, and then moving on, once this was done, there's always, you need a good way to display this. The way the blaster is, because of the scope, it is very lopsided, so it will not stay up on its own. And most of the stands, if you can't find them, you'll see them cradled, by these ends, but you still need some way to offset it so that it doesn't tip. So, after noodling the idea around, I came up with this design, which was a couple different purposes. One, I had this scrap piece of wood from a previous project, so I like to repurpose things whenever I can. And then it gave me a little bit of a different type of stand than some of my other blasters. So what I ended up doing was I milled out using a 1/8 inch mill here, basically the profile of what the bottom of the blaster would be. And this basically is a static fit, just like that. It is pretty stable. I mean, obviously if you really wanted to knock it over, you could, but for this to be housed in a display case, I think it works just fine, and it was pretty simple. So after I finished milling out this cutout, really I sanded everything down, used some Minwax walnut stain that I had left over from my mini Mazbox build a few years ago. Let it dry, went through another round of sanding, finished it, put on another layer of stain, and then for the final finish I wet sanded this with 500 grit sandpaper, and then 2 coats of Krylon matte clear. And then at the end I put on some of these rubber feet, and then there you go. So pretty straightforward build, if you ask me. And Polymer Armory, highly recommended, very good cast, quick shipment, no issues there, highly recommended, and I think this is one of the better versions of the blaster that is out there. So that wraps this part up. If you've made it this far, I've included some of the build process right here at the end of the video here, so if you are interested, please take a look. But otherwise, thanks for following along. Take care. Bye-bye.
Hey everyone, if you've gotten this far you would have seen the finished blaster already, but this is a quick look at how it looks like as received from Polymer Armory. As I mentioned before, this is the Hero version of the Scout Blaster Kit. So you can see these are resin based. Pretty decent cast, good details. This is before any sort of cleanup has been done. The only thing I've done this far is to clean off this with some warm soapy water just to get some of that mold release agents off. But there's still more work to do here, which you'll see as the video goes on. But this is really just kind of a first look at everything. So casting looks pretty darn good. And the main blaster section here. There are some areas here, like the seam lines, that will need to be cleaned up and filled and addressed. But I think overall it looks like a very good cast. Okay, it does include the trigger guard, and that will slot in just like that, so everything matches up pretty nicely there. He does include 2 scope rings. One is a resin piece here, which is the gray. The black is an aluminum version, and this will go on just like that, right? Very simple here. So this is not a very complicated build. It's really just an assembly and a finishing here. It comes with assortment of hardware for the guard as well as for the scope rings and the scope itself. So all right, we'll move on to the next steps here.
All right guys, so let's get started here. So one of the things that Eric at Polymer Armory provides are these instructions, and so it kind of just walks you through in terms of sanding and filling in some of the drainage holes and whatnot. So I'll be following this for the rest of the build. And so one of the first things we'll look at are the seam lines. So you can see here from the cast, looks like he's already started to smooth down some of the seams. But you'll see here, you know, there's some divots there. So I'll probably end up filling that up. I'll be using the Tamiya putty later on, but as I take a look here, casting is actually really nice, but you'll see here it's a little rough edges there, so I'll use some of the putty to fill in those gaps and just smooth them out a little bit. So I think from a seam perspective, the scope here we can bypass. When we get to the actual blaster itself, you can see same thing. He's taken out and smoothed out some of those lines. There's a little bit of a divot there, so we'll fill that in. But you can see here along the ridges, there's those seams that will need to get cleaned up. So I'll probably use a combination of X-Acto knife as well as nail file and try to sand them down. Same thing on the underside here. A little bit more pronounced there. Probably end up filling that in. Those seam lines are much more pronounced, so I'll get working on that first, and then you can see there are some of those drainage holes that will need to get filled in. Same thing, I'll be using the Tamiya putty for that. Yeah, so let's get started. So here what I'm doing is getting into the crevices just to make things just a little bit sharper. There's a little bit of just kind of, I guess I'll call it slag, just some excess resin pieces or parts here. Not a whole lot, but since I'm here doing this, I'll just clean up. So using the same X-Acto knife, make short order of that. So you can see it looks pretty good, and you know, since it's in this gray color state, yeah, you can see a lot more of the imperfections. But I think once we get this painted up, you won't see those minor blemishes. But then again, for this being a Star Wars blaster, it does lend itself to some weathering as well, which we can take care of that later. But that looks pretty good. Here, I'll probably use some of that Tamiya putty here just to smooth it out, and then I'll sand it down. Same thing here. But for the most part, everything looks pretty good. There's not a whole lot of cleanup work that needs to be done. So then now, what I'll end up doing is I'm going to carefully open up some of these holes. All right, next up will be to fill these holes. And I know I had talked about using the Tamiya putty, but I also have this plastic putty from Vallejo. And I think I'm going to go with this because it has a nice thin tip like that. So I can really hopefully get real precise and go right inside. So that's what I'm going to do now. So you just squeeze it in and let some of the excess come out. And then what I do is I'll multiply, do it again, and then we'll double check again, see if there's already more filled or not. But here's a little bit of a closer look. I think everything turned out quite nicely. You could see still a little bit of imperfections, but this isn't meant to be completely perfect. So, but I think all of the seam lines was able to get them at least adequately knocked down. So you don't see it as much, it's not as noticeable. Remember, I did quite a bit of work right in here, so I think that one all filled up pretty nicely. And then for the scope, yeah, I think everything turned out to be quite nice. You can still see a little bit of imperfections there. And a little bit there, but that's just to my eye. So I think this is coming along well. So what I'll end up doing next is I'll do the final assembly, which is basically just attaching the scope and the trigger guard. And then I'll look for some reference images and look to see how much weathering I need to do. I don't think a whole lot, but there will still be some that I'll end up doing. All right, stay tuned.